Welcome to FusionSpectra. Tonight's story follows homeless veteran meets rock on the street. What happens next changes everything. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories or complete our 1,000 subscribers. It started on a chilly November evening in 2019, just outside the hustle of Times Square. A figure sat hunched on the pavement, his jacket tattered, his boots barely clinging to his feet. James Jim Carter, a 48-year-old veteran of the Iraq War, hadn't spoken to his family in years, haunted by memories of IED explosions and the faces of comrades he'd lost. Jim had drifted into homelessness after his discharge, struggling with PTSD and alcoholism. This night felt no different from others. Jim scribbled a sign on cardboard: "Veteran in need." Anything helps. God bless New Yorkers, busy as ever. Hurried past their faces obscured by the glow of their phones. Jim didn't expect much. Most days he made just enough for coffee. Then a black SUV rolled to a stop. Nearby security guards exited first, scanning the area out. Stepped a tall man in a crisp navy coat. Former President Rock. The moment seemed surreal. Jim blinked, unsure of his exhaustion, had finally driven him to hallucinate. Rock spotted Jim almost immediately. "What's your story, soldier?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and concern. Jim hesitated. Most people didn't care enough to ask, but something in Trump's direct gaze told him to speak. "I'm a veteran, served 2 tours in Iraq, lost a lot of friends there and myself too. I guess." Jim K's voice trembled as he just ed to his sign. "Got discharged. Couldn't hold a job. Couldn't keep my family now. I'm here." Rock listened intently, uncharacteristically silent. Then he did something shocking. He sat down beside Jim, ignoring the startled gasps of bystanders and the unease of his security detail. "Do you know who I am?" Rock asked. Jim nodded. "Of course I do so. Why don't we do something about this?" Rock gestured to Jim K's surroundings. "No vet should be out here. Not on my watch." The conversation turned deeper, darker. Jim shared stories of sleepless nights, the nightmares, the guilt of surviving when others hadn't. Rock, often brash and unyielding in public, appeared almost vulnerable, his posture softening as he spoke about the struggles of his late brother Fred, who battled alcoholism. "You remind me of him." Rock admitted Fred was a good man, but he needed someone to believe in him. "Maybe you need the same." What Rock said next would ripple across the media in the coming days. "Get in the car. Let's fix this together." The story didn't end there. Behind the scenes, Jim's sudden thrust into the limelight drew mixed reactions, some praise. Trump's spontaneous act of kindness, while others questioned the authenticity. It started on a chilly November evening in 2019, just outside the hustle of Times Square. A figure sat hunched on the pavement, his jacket tattered, his boots barely clinging to his feet. James Jim Carter, a 48-year-old veteran of the Iraq War, hadn't spoken to his family in years, haunted by memories of IED explosions and the faces of comrades he'd lost. Jim had drifted into homelessness after his discharge, struggling to find a place in a world that felt foreign and unforgiving. The tourists walking past barely spared him a glance, their faces lit with the glow of nearby advertisements. But one man stopped, a flash of recognition. Crossing his face, he wore a black overcoat, and the way he stood with authority and command made Jim uneasy. "Hey, you served, didn't you?" the man asked, his voice cutting through the noise of the street. Jim looked up reluctantly, his face gaunt and aged. Beyond his years, "Yeah, what's it to you?" he muttered, pulling his frayed blanket tighter around himself. The man knelt, brushing off the protests of his entourage. His piercing blue eyes met Jim's. "I'm Rock," he said, simply. "Tell me your story." Jim's heart clenched. He'd seen Rock on television, heard the speeches, but he never imagined they'd cross paths. His throat tightened as he began to talk, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. His wife leaving him the nightmares, the drinking, the shelter beds that never seemed to be available. For the first time in years, Jim didn't feel invisible. Rock listened, his brow furrowed, in an expression that seemed surprisingly genuine. No one should live like this. Rock said, his voice firm, especially not someone who fought for this country. A limousine pulled up, but Rock didn't move. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a card. "Take this," he said. "It's my assistant number tomorrow morning. You'll have a place to stay, and I want you to tell me more about what's happening to veterans like you." Jim stared at the card, his hands trembling. He didn't know if he could trust it, didn't know if this was some kind of cruel joke. But then Rock leaned closer, lowering his voice, and Jim. He added, "You deserve to be seen, to be heard." Jim nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. He'd long forgotten how to shed. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. Rock stood, clapping a hand on Jim's shoulder. "Just promise me you'll pick up that phone tomorrow." As the limousine disappeared into the night, Jim sat there clutching the card like a lifeline. Around him, the city buzzed on, oblivious to the tiny spark of hope ignited in a broken man's heart. But this was only the beginning. The next morning would bring revelations neither Jim nor Rock could have foreseen, unraveling secrets that would change not only their lives, but also shake the nation. The next morning, Jim woke up to the sound of his own wheezing breath. The card still clung to his hand like a sacred relic, the smudged ink marking a promise he wasn't sure he dared to believe in. He hadn't slept in years without the sound of incoming mortar shells haunting his dreams. But something about that night had been different. Perhaps it was the man's eyes, unshaken and piercing, or the way he had leaned in, not just to hear but to understand. He found a payphone 3 blocks down, trembling as he dialed the number. His voice cracked as he asked for the assistant, whose name he couldn't quite remember. "Yes, this is Jim Carter," he said cautiously. I met Mr. Rock last night." The voice on the other end was calm and reassuring. "Mr. Carter, we've been expecting your call. Transportation is already arranged to pick you up. Be ready in an hour." Jim stared at the receiver, his mind racing. Who does this for a stranger? He half expected a squad car to show up and arrest him for loitering instead. But an hour later, a sleek black SUV pulled up. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, greeted him by name, and opened the door. "Mr. Rock wanted to ensure your comfort," he said. Jim slid inside hesitantly, his world spinning faster than he could keep up with. He was driven to a hotel in Midtown, the kind of place he hadn't seen since his glory days. As a young soldier, when he was shown to his room, he was met with clean sheets, hot shower, and a set of clothes waiting for him for the first time in years. He cried, his sobs echoing off the tiled bathroom walls. Later that afternoon, a knock came at the door. A man in casual clothes holding a clipboard introduced himself as a counselor. "Mr. Rock wanted to make sure you had someone to talk to," he explained over coffee. Jim hesitated, but eventually opened up about the horrors he'd endured, losing his squad to an ambush, the guilt of surviving, and the bottomless pit he'd fallen into. After returning home for weeks, Jim remained at the hotel, slowly piecing himself together with therapy and support. One day, Rock visited him in person, as if Jim's story had left a mark on him. "You're not just another headline to me," Jim Rock said firmly. "I want you to know that through tears," Jim said, "no one's cared for me like this. Not since the Army. I thought I'd been forgotten." Rock shook his head. "You're not forgotten, and I want to make sure no other veteran feels this way." Months passed, and Jim found himself part of a larger movement. Rock launched an initiative for homeless veterans inspired by their chance encounter. Jim became a spokesperson, sharing his story to rooms full of strangers, his voice shaky but his heart resolute. One night after an event in D.C., Jim returned to his hotel room. He opened a letter from his estranged daughter, Emily. It was a single page written in shaky handwriting. Dad, I saw your speech tonight. I'm so proud of you. Please call me. I've missed you so much. Jim's hands trembled as he picked up the phone. When Emily answered, her voice filled the emptiness he'd carried for years. Dad, come home, she said through sobs. We'll figure it out together that night. For the first time in years, Jim fell asleep with a smile, the sound of his daughter's voice echoing in his heart, and though life was far from perfect, he knew he was no longer alone. The city moved on, as it always did, but for Jim Carter, the world was finally starting to make sense again. Sometimes all it took was someone to stop and see you, truly see you, for everything to change.